The morning light filtered through the flour-dusted windows of Sweet Haven Bakery, casting soft golden patterns across the wooden countertops that had witnessed 3 generations of love, laughter, and fresh-baked bread. Natalie Rivers stood in the center of her kingdom, hands deep in a bowl of sourdough starter that had been passed down from her grandmother 60 years ago. The living yeast bubbled and breathed beneath her fingers, a connection to every woman in her family who had stood in this exact spot, creating magic from flour and water. The morning rush would begin in 40 minutes, and everything had to be perfect. Croissants needed another 15 minutes in the oven. The cinnamon rolls were proofing on the back counter, their sweet perfection filling the air. Chocolate chip cookies cooled on wire racks, their edges crisp and center still soft, exactly the way customers had loved them since her grandmother first opened these doors in 1964. This place was more than a business to Natalie. It was a living memory of the woman who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7. Every recipe card in her grandmother's handwriting, every scratch on the old wooden mixing table, every story from regular customers who had been coming here for decades. These things mattered more than profit margins or modern efficiency. They were the threads that connected past to present, that made a community more than just a collection of strangers living on the same street. Bethany Cole pushed through the back door, bringing cold November air and the energy of someone who had already consumed too much coffee. She had worked alongside Natalie for 8 years, transitioning from part-time help during college to full partner in everything but name. Her apron was already on, hair tied back in a practiced knot. The morning crowd is going to be intense today, Bethany said, washing her hands at the deep sink. I saw at least 20 people already waiting outside. Mrs. Patterson brought her knitting. Mr. Cho has his newspaper. Same wonderful chaos as always. Natalie smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of purpose settle around her shoulders like her grandmother's old shawl. This was what mattered. Not wealth or status or expansion plans, but this daily ritual of feeding people, creating space for connection, maintaining something precious in a world that seemed determined to replace everything meaningful with something cheaper and faster and less human. The envelope arrived at 9:47 a.m., delivered by a courier in an expensive suit who seemed uncomfortable standing among the customers enjoying their morning pastries. He handed Natalie a thick manila package and asked her to sign for it, his expression suggesting he knew exactly what devastating news he was delivering and wanted to escape before she opened it. Natalie took the envelope to the back office, a tiny room barely large enough for a desk and filing cabinet. Bethany followed, sensing something terrible in the formal weight of the documents. The letterhead read Crane Development Corporation in elegant embossed letters. Victoria Crane. The name was familiar from local news coverage of luxury developments that had transformed 3 historic neighborhoods in the past 5 years, always replacing character with glass and steel, always displacing longtime residents in favor of wealthy newcomers who wanted urban living without any of the actual community. The letter was brief and emotionless, each word a small blade carefully placed. The building had been purchased. All commercial leases would not be renewed. Tenants had 60 days to vacate. The entire block would be demolished for a luxury mixed-use development featuring high-end retail and premium apartments starting at $4,000 per month. No exceptions. No negotiations. The decision was final. Natalie read it 3 times, each reading making it more real and more impossible. 60 days. 2 months to pack up 60 years of history. 8 weeks to say goodbye to the place where her grandmother had taught her to measure ingredients by feel rather than scales, where she had learned that baking was as much about intuition as instruction, where she had held her grandmother's hand during the final months of cancer, coming to the bakery every morning because the woman refused to die anywhere but in the place she loved most. "They can't do this," Bethany said, reading over Natalie's shoulder. "We have a lease. We have rights. There are laws protecting small businesses. But Natalie knew better. She had signed a year-to-year lease because the rent was affordable, and the previous landlord had been a friend of her grandmother's. That landlord had died 18 months ago, and his children had sold the building to the highest bidder without consulting any of the tenants. Legal, perhaps, but cruel in its efficiency. The rest of the day passed in a horrible blur. Natalie served customers with mechanical precision, smiling automatically while her mind tried to process the impossible task ahead. Where would she go? How could she afford to relocate? Starting over would require capital she didn't have, in a market where commercial rents had tripled in 5 years. Her savings account held maybe $15,000, enough to live on for a few months, but nowhere near enough to secure a new location, buy equipment, establish a new customer base. By evening, news had spread through the neighborhood. Regular. Customers came not to buy bread, but to offer sympathy, to ask if there was anything they could do, to share their own stories of displacement and loss as the city transformed around them. Mrs. Patterson cried. Mr. Cho offered to help her find a lawyer. The Ramirez family brought flowers. Their concern was genuine and completely useless. Natalie locked the door at closing time and sat alone in the darkening bakery. The ovens had cooled. The cases were empty. The chairs were upside down on tables, waiting for tomorrow's opening that suddenly felt both inevitable and pointless. What was the purpose of continuing when an ending had already been written? She thought about her grandmother, about the strength it had taken to open a business. As a widow in 1964, to build something from nothing in a world that didn't make space for women with ambitions. That woman had survived her husband's death, raised a daughter alone, built a legacy that had fed thousands of people and employed dozens over the decades, and now her granddaughter was going to let it end because a wealthy developer wanted to build apartments for people who would never appreciate what had been destroyed to make room for them. The anger came suddenly, hot and clarifying. Natalie stood and turned on every light in the bakery, letting it blaze against the darkness outside. She would fight this. She would organize the community, find a lawyer, talk to the media, make enough noise that Victoria Crane would regret choosing this block for her soulless development. She would not let her grandmother's legacy be erased without a struggle. But even as determination hardened in her chest, a small voice whispered the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. Sometimes fighting wasn't enough. Sometimes the wealthy and powerful simply took what they wanted, and ordinary people could do nothing but watch their worlds crumble and try to survive the aftermath. The weeks that followed felt like watching a beloved home slowly sink into the ocean. Natalie fought with everything she had, but fighting against unlimited money and legal teams proved as effective as trying to hold back the tide with her bare hands. The community organized protests that made local news for one evening before being forgotten. A petition gathered 3,000 signatures that Victoria Crane's lawyers dismissed without comment. The city council expressed sympathy and did absolutely nothing. Bethany helped pack 60 years of memories into cardboard boxes, each one a small funeral. Recipe cards in her grandmother's handwriting went into plastic sleeves. The old mixing, bowls wrapped carefully in newspaper. The wooden spoons worn smooth by decades of use. The commercial mixer that had cost a month's profits back in 1983. Everything was cataloged and stored in a facility Natalie could barely afford, waiting for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The final day came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Natalie stood alone in the empty bakery at dawn, the space echoing with absence. The ovens would never heat again. The cases would never fill with fresh pastries. The door would never open to welcome morning customers, seeking comfort and community along with their coffee. She locked the door for the last time and walked away without looking back, because looking back would have broken something in her that needed to stay whole just a little longer. Her savings evaporated within 6 weeks. Rent on the tiny apartment. Storage fees. basic expenses that seemed enormous now that income had stopped flowing. Natalie needed work immediately, and her options were limited. Bakery owner didn't translate well to other careers. She applied everywhere that might value her customer service experience and food handling knowledge, lowering her expectations with each rejection. The Riverside Cafe hired her as a server 3 days before her rent was due. The pay was minimum, wage plus tips, barely enough to survive. The work was exhausting and humbling, taking orders from people who didn't know she had once owned a business, who saw only another waitress bringing them coffee and sandwiches. But it was income, and income meant survival. So Natalie showed up early for every shift and smiled through the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Owen Fletcher first appeared on a Tuesday morning during the breakfast rush. Tall and quiet, he ordered black coffee and oatmeal, sat alone by the window with a sketchbook, and left generous tips. He came back Wednesday, then Thursday. By the second week, Natalie recognized him immediately and had his coffee ready when he walked through the door. "You're very observant," Owen said one morning, surprised to find his usual order waiting at his usual table. "Occupational habit," Natalie replied, refilling the coffee pot at the next table. "I used to run a bakery. You learn to remember what people love." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a flicker of interest that went beyond casual customer conversation. "Used to? What happened?" The question opened a door Natalie usually kept firmly closed, but something about this stranger made honesty feel safe instead of vulnerable. Maybe it was the genuine curiosity in his voice. Maybe it was simply that she was tired of pretending the loss didn't hurt. Developer bought the building, demolished it for luxury condos. 60 years of history erased in 60 days. Owen's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. His face registered something Natalie couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was everything," Natalie said simply, and moved to the next table before the conversation could crack open the grief she carried so carefully. But Owen kept coming back, and their conversations grew longer. He asked about her grandmother, about the bakery's history, about what made a business more than just profit margins. Natalie found herself talking about things she hadn't shared with anyone except Bethany, about the magic of watching dough rise, about the satisfaction of feeding people food made with actual care, about the loss that went deeper than financial. Owen listened with an intensity that suggested he understood something about losing purpose. He talked about studying architecture because he wanted to design spaces that improved people's lives, about the compromise between ideals and reality in corporate work, about the growing sense that he was using his skills to destroy communities rather than build them. "I work for a development company," he admitted one morning, 3 weeks into their coffee shop friendship. "We buy properties, tear down old buildings, construct new ones. I tell myself we're improving neighborhoods, but mostly we're just displacing people who can't afford what comes next." Natalie felt a chill despite the warm cafe air. "Which company?" Owen hesitated, and in that hesitation Natalie knew. "Crane Development." The words hung between them like a wall suddenly constructed from nothing. Natalie stepped back, coffee pot clutched tight in her hands. "You work for Victoria Crane?" "I design buildings. I don't make the business decisions." Owen's voice was defensive, but not dismissive. "I didn't know about your bakery specifically until you told me. We have dozens of projects. I just draw the plans." "You're the architect for the building that replaced my grandmother's legacy." Natalie's voice was steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "You drew plans for luxury apartments on the exact spot where 3 generations of my family fed this community." Owen looked stricken, guilt written across every feature. "I didn't know. If I had known your story, if I had understood what was being destroyed, would it have mattered?" Natalie interrupted. "Would you have walked away from your paycheck because some bakery owner was losing everything?" Would Victoria Crane have cared about one person's loss when she could make millions? I don't know, Owen said honestly. But I wish I had asked. I wish someone in our meetings had mentioned that we were demolishing 60 years of community history. I wish we were required to care about what existed before we erased it. Natalie turned away, needing distance from this man who represented everything that had destroyed her life, even if he hadn't personally wielded the wrecking ball. She avoided his table for the rest of the morning, letting another server handle his section. When she looked up from the register an hour later, Owen was gone, and a $50 tip sat under his coffee cup with a note written on a napkin. I'm sorry, not because it helps, but because you deserve better than what happened. We all do. That evening, Bethany called with unexpected news. Henry Park, who ran the community center 6 blocks from where the bakery had stood, wanted to meet with Natalie. She almost refused, exhausted by sympathy that couldn't change her situation, but Bethany insisted the conversation would be worth her time. Henry Park was 70 years old with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly from age or nervousness. His community center occupied an old church building, mostly empty now that funding had dried up and programs had closed. He led Natalie to a large commercial kitchen that hadn't been used in 5 years, equipment dusty but functional. The church used to run meal programs for families, Henry explained. But we lost our grant funding and couldn't afford to continue. This kitchen just sits here now, wasted space in a building that's mostly empty. He turned to Natalie with an expression of hope that seemed almost painful. What if you used it? Natalie stared at the industrial ovens, the long metal counters, the walk-in refrigerator. I can't afford rent on a space like this. I can barely afford my apartment. No, rent, Henry said firmly. Use it for free if you'll teach baking classes to neighborhood kids. Give them a skill, a purpose, something to hope for. You get a kitchen. The community gets their bakery back in some form. I get to stop feeling like this building is dying while I watch. The offer was impossible and perfect and terrifying. Natalie had no money for ingredients, no customer base, no idea how to rebuild from nothing. But she also had nothing to lose except the small spark of purpose that had just ignited in her chest, fragile as a candle flame but burning nevertheless. I'll need help, Natalie said slowly, the words building toward something that felt like hope. Equipment repair, supply donations, someone to spread the word? We'll figure it out together, Henry replied. Communities are built by people who refuse to accept that nothing can be done. Your grandmother knew that. Now it's your turn. Natalie walked home that night with her mind racing through possibilities. She could start small, teaching weekend classes while keeping her cafe job. Use social media to build awareness. Ask for ingredient donations from local stores. Create something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. It wasn't her grandmother's bakery, but maybe it could be something equally meaningful in its own way. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I heard about Henry's offer. I'm good with repairs and renovation. If you need help, I'm available. No strings attached. Just trying to do something good for once. Owen. Natalie stared at the message for long minutes, emotions warring in her chest. Anger at what his company had done, appreciation for his honesty, suspicion about his motives, hope that maybe, just maybe, something beautiful could rise from the ashes of what had burned. She typed 3 words and hit send before she could change her mind. Saturday at 9. Owen arrived at the community center on Saturday morning with a truck full of tools and a determination that surprised Natalie. He assessed the kitchen with the practiced eye of someone who understood how spaces functioned, making notes about ventilation issues, outdated wiring, and equipment that needed immediate attention. Within an hour, he had created a detailed renovation plan that would cost almost nothing but require significant labor. The bones are good, Owen explained, sketching modifications on a notepad. We just need to wake everything up. I can handle the electrical and structural work. You focus on what you do best. They worked side by side through the weekend, conversation flowing easier than Natalie expected. Owen talked about growing up in foster care, about finding stability through architecture school, about the slow realization that his job was making the world worse instead of better. Natalie shared stories about her grandmother, about learning to bake at 6 years old, about the devastating years after her parents died when the bakery had been the only constant in a world that felt dangerously unstable. By Sunday evening, the kitchen gleamed. Equipment hummed to life after years of silence. The space felt alive again, filled with possibility instead of dust. Natalie stood at the center of it and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not just hope, but genuine excitement about what came next. The first baking class launched 2 weeks later with 8 neighborhood teenagers who came mostly for the promised free food. Natalie taught them to make bread from scratch, explaining the science of yeast and gluten development while their hands learned the rhythm of kneading. Owen documented everything on social media, capturing moments of concentration and triumph. When perfect loaves emerged from the ovens, the posts went viral overnight. Local news picked up the story of a displaced bakery owner rebuilding through community education. Donations poured in from strangers moved by the narrative of resilience. Within a month, Natalie was teaching 4 classes per week to waiting lists of students, and the community center kitchen operated every evening, filling the neighborhood with the scent of fresh bread. Victoria Crane discovered Owen's involvement through a tagged photo showing him repairing an oven while Natalie taught in the background. She called him into her office on a Tuesday morning, fury radiating from every perfectly tailored inch of her designer suit. "You're working with the woman whose bakery we demolished?" Victoria's voice was cold as winter steel. "You're helping her operate an unlicensed commercial kitchen in violation of zoning regulations?" Owen met her gaze steadily, feeling something settle in his chest that might have been courage or simply the relief of finally choosing correctly. "I'm volunteering at a community center that operates legally under nonprofit status. What Natalie does there is teaching, not commercial baking." "You're fired." Victoria delivered the words like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Clear your desk today and tell your girlfriend that I'll be reporting her operation to every regulatory agency I can find. That community center will be investigated, inspected, and shut down before summer." Owen stood, gathering his dignity around him like armor. "You can fire me. You can make threats. But you can't stop people from helping each other. You destroyed something beautiful because you could, because profit mattered more than people. But we're building something better from what you broke." He walked out of Crane Development without looking back, feeling lighter than he had in years, despite losing his 6-figure salary and health insurance. Some things mattered more than security. Some people were worth fighting for. Natalie was teaching when Owen arrived at the community center, her hands guiding a teenager through the delicate process of shaping croissants. He waited until the class ended, until students had left with bags of pastries and promises to return next week. Then he told her everything. "She's going to come after us," Natalie said, fear flickering across her face. "Victoria Crane doesn't lose gracefully." "Let her try." Owen took Natalie's flour-dusted hands in his. "We're not doing anything wrong. We have community support. We have media attention. We have something she'll never understand, which is that people matter more than profit margins." The regulatory inspections came exactly as Victoria had promised. Health department officials arrived unannounced, clipboards ready to document violations. They found a commercial kitchen operating at the highest safety standards, with documentation for every ingredient source and temperature log. Fire marshals inspected and found code-compliant equipment. Zoning officers confirmed that educational programming fell well within the community center's nonprofit status. Victoria Crane's luxury development, meanwhile, was failing spectacularly. The community had organized a boycott that extended beyond just refusing to rent apartments. Local businesses refused to supply the building. Service workers declined contracts. The pristine lobby stood empty, while social media campaigns highlighted exactly what had been destroyed to build it. Wealthy potential tenants chose other neighborhoods, uncomfortable with the visible community anger surrounding the property. By spring, everything had transformed in ways neither Natalie nor Owen could have predicted. A local business owner, moved by their story, offered Natalie a storefront at a rent she could actually afford with her teaching income and growing online bread subscription service. Owen started his own architecture firm focused on community-centered design, with Henry Park's community center renovation as his first portfolio piece. Clients came steadily, people who wanted buildings that enhanced rather than destroyed the neighborhoods around them. The new bakery opened on a Saturday morning in May with a line around the block. Sweet Haven Bakery, the sign read, honoring her grandmother's original name. But this version was different, better in some ways. The space featured an open teaching kitchen where customers could watch bread being made. A portion of every sale funded scholarships for baking students. The walls displayed photographs from the original bakery, alongside images of current students, connecting past to present in a visual story of resilience. Owen designed every inch of it, creating a space that balanced efficiency with warmth, that honored tradition while embracing innovation. He and Natalie had worked on the plans together late into countless evenings, their collaboration deepening into something neither had expected, but both desperately needed. "Your grandmother would be proud," Owen said on opening day, watching Natalie serve her first customer in the new space. Natalie smiled, feeling the truth of it settle around her shoulders like a blessing. She would be. Not because I rebuilt exactly what was lost, but because I didn't let losing it destroy me. Because I found a way to keep feeding people and building community. She turned to Owen, this man who had been part of her destruction, and her resurrection, who had chosen integrity over income, who had helped her transform devastation into possibility. "Thank you for showing up that first Saturday, for choosing us over her, for believing something better was possible." Owen pulled her close, and the kiss that followed tasted like hope and flower and the future neither had known they were building toward. The bakery filled with customers and laughter and the rich scent of bread baking. Outside, spring sun warmed the street where Victoria Crane's failed development stood mostly empty, a monument to the fact that communities couldn't be demolished quite as easily as buildings. Natalie had lost everything and found something immeasurably better. Not just a bakery, but a purpose. Not just a business, but a movement. Not just survival, but a love that had grown from ashes and disaster into something solid and real and worth every moment of pain that had preceded it. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen was actually the beginning of the best thing possible. Sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what truly mattered. And sometimes the person who helped destroy your old life was exactly the person you needed to help build your new one. The bread would keep rising. The community would keep gathering. And love, like yeast, would continue to transform ordinary ingredients into something extraordinary. The end.